Montana Territory, August 1882. The cowboy rode into town with a girl on his horse. Nobody knew she had just shot her father dead. Dust swirled at the edge of Cold Creek, a town too small for lawmen and too tired for gossip, though that never stopped it. The sun was hanging low, bleeding gold across the hills as Victor Callahan guided his mare down the main road. His hat was pulled low, jaw tight, and behind him sat a girl in a torn cotton dress, her hands wrapped tight around his waist like she was holding on to the last thing keeping her from falling apart. She had not said much since he found her near the edge of the pine brake, blood on her hands and gunpowder in her hair. Victor slowed the horse in front of the livery, glancing over his shoulder. "You all right to get down?" She nodded once, slipped off the horse with a quiet wince, and landed on shaky legs. Victor kept a hand near her back, not touching, but close enough. She looked too young to be carrying the weight she had, but the steel in her eyes told him she was grown. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low. "Cassidy," she said. "Cassidy Cooper," he nodded. "Victor Callahan." She blinked up at him. "Why did you help me?" He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Because you looked like you needed it." Cassidy lowered her gaze. "I did." They crossed the street to the boarding house. Victor got them a room on the second floor. No one asked questions. He paid in cash, and Cassidy never looked anywhere long enough to draw suspicion. She did not speak again until the door shut behind them and the sunlit dust settled in the quiet. "He was going to kill me," she said, voice flat. Victor turned from the window. Cassidy was standing in the middle of the room, her hands clenched into fists, trembling. "My father." "He came home drunk, again. But this time he had his rifle. I could see it in his eyes. He was going to shoot me, and I beat him to it." Victor didn't say anything. He crossed the room slow, took the chair across from her, and waited. "I buried him out back. I took the horse and ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away." "You did what you had to do," Victor said. "If he was coming for you with a gun, then you were defending yourself." "I know that," she said, her voice breaking. "But it doesn't feel like it." Victor stood and crossed to her. He did not reach for her, but he stood close enough that she could lean into him if she wanted. She did slowly, her forehead pressing against his chest like someone who had not rested in years. "I do not want to go back," she whispered. "You will not," Victor said. "Not if I can help it." They stayed in Cold Creek the next 2 days. Cassidy kept to the room mostly, staring out the window or curled up with a blanket over her shoulders. Victor checked on her, brought her food, and never asked more than she was willing to give. She started to speak more about the ranch her father ran into the ground, about her mother who died 5 winters back, about the way the house turned quieter and meaner each year. Victor listened. He did not try to fix it with words. He just stayed. On the 3rd evening, she asked, "What about you?" "You got family?" Victor leaned back in the creaky chair by the bed. "Used to. Folks died of fever when I was 16. I had a brother, but he ran off east and I never heard from him again. Since then, just me and my horse." "You ever think about settling down?" He studied her face, the way she was looking at him, not afraid, not unsure, just curious. "I used to think about it. But the kind of life I led, it never seemed fair to ask someone to share it." Cassidy smiled, a small, tired thing. "Maybe you just never found the right person." He looked at her then, really looked. "Maybe not." They left Cold Creek at dawn the next day, no questions asked. Victor bought her a new dress, something plain but clean. He told her they would ride south, maybe toward Wyoming, where land was cheap and folks kept to themselves. She agreed without hesitation. 2 days into the ride, they made camp beneath a ridge where the river bent wide and quiet. Cassidy sat near the fire, knees drawn up, watching Victor with thoughtful eyes. He was slicing jerky, his face lined with quiet focus. "You saved my life," she said. Victor glanced up. "You had already saved yourself. I just helped with the rest." She shook her head. "You could have turned me in." "Left me?" "I would not do that." "Why?" He hesitated, then set the knife down. Because when I saw you standing there, shaking and wild-eyed, I saw something I knew. I saw what it feels like to lose everything and still have to keep going. Cassidy's throat tightened. You don't even know me. I want to, he said. That night she curled up beside him under the stars, her head tucked near his shoulder, and he did not move away. He laid his hand over hers, and she held it like it was the only solid thing in the world. They rode another week, crossing into Wyoming territory. They found a little cabin, long abandoned but sturdy, tucked in a hollow near a stream. Victor fixed the roof while Cassidy scrubbed the hearth. The silence between them settled into something easy. One night, as the fire cracked low, she turned toward him and said, I think I want to stay here. With you. Victor looked at her, his face unreadable. You sure? She nodded. I don't want to run anymore. And I don't want to be alone. He reached out, touched her cheek, and said, Then you will never be. When he kissed her, it was slow and steady, and she leaned into it like it was the first good thing that had been hers in a long time. And for the first time in years, Victor Callahan felt like he had found home. Victor rose before the sun, as he always did, and stepped outside into the thin blue hush. The air still held the edge of night, cool and damp with mountain breath. He filled his lungs and looked out across the clearing where the ash from last night's fire still whispered smoke. Inside the cabin, Cassidy slept curled beneath the quilt they'd found in the old trunk, her breathing steady, her brow finally smooth. He walked down to the stream with his coffee tin and squatted at the edge. The water moved slow here, tugging gently at the banks. He dipped the tin and let the chill of it wake his hands. Above him, a raven called once and then was quiet. By the time he returned, Cassidy was up, her hair still mussed from sleep. She stood near the hearth, barefoot on the plank floor, watching the fire she'd just coaxed to life. I thought I smelled coffee, she said. He handed her the tin. It's bitter. She nodded and sipped anyway. I like bitter. Victor leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You sleep all right. I dreamed I was back in that house, she said, but the door was gone. I couldn't get out. He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. I think we should plant something, she said. There's a patch out back that gets good sun. Could grow squash, beans maybe, if we're staying. We are. Cassidy smiled faintly, then looked at the floorboards. I want to build something, not just hide. Victor stepped forward, set a hand on her shoulder. Then we will. They spent the morning clearing the patch behind the cabin. The soil was heavy with root and rock, but Cassidy worked without pause, sleeves rolled high, hands blistering. Victor watched her now and then, the way she moved like she was trying to earn the air she breathed. By midday, they'd marked out rows with pine branches and hauled buckets from the stream. She paused and wiped her brow with her sleeve. When I was little, she said, my mother taught me how to string beans on a line. We'd hang them by the window to dry. She said they looked like little green soldiers waiting for orders. Victor knelt beside her, pressing a stone into the corner of the row. You talk about her different than you do your father. She was different. Her voice went quiet. She used to sing when she thought I was asleep. Songs I never heard anywhere else. I think she missed where she came from, but she didn't say much about it. Where was that? A place called Ash Fork, Arizona territory. They moved north when the drought came. Victor nodded. You ever think of going back there? Cassidy shook her head. There's nothing there for me, just memory. She stood and brushed dirt from her skirt. I want to make new ones. That night, the wind shifted and brought the scent of pine smoke. Victor stepped out to check the hills and saw a flicker far off, but there, someone had made camp not 2 miles off. He returned inside and bolted the door. Cassidy looked up from where she sat sewing, a tear in the quilt. What is it? Riders, maybe, could be passing through. Her needle paused. You think they're looking for someone? Victor met her eyes. I think we keep quiet for a few days. She nodded and folded the square of quilt over her lap. Later, as the fire settled into coals, Cassidy stood beside him at the window. Her voice was soft. You were someone before all this, weren't you? He didn't look away from the dark. I did some things I didn't want to carry with me, so I left them behind. Do you regret it? I regret not leaving sooner. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Me too. They stood like that until the wind died down and the night lay still again. In the days that followed, they kept to the cabin. Cassidy tended the rows they'd planted. Victor hunted small game, brought back rabbit and once a grouse. They spoke little during the day, but in the evenings, she read aloud from an old book they'd found on the shelf, a journal left by the man who built the place. He planted sunflowers, she said one night, turning a yellowed page. Rows and rows of them, just so his wife could see them from the kitchen window. Victor smiled. That's so. Cassidy turned toward him. Do you think we could do that? Come spring, if that's what you want. I think I'd like that. She set the book aside and crossed to where he sat. She knelt beside him, hesitated, then reached for his hand. Thank you for not asking me to forget. Victor turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers. Some things you carry, but they don't have to carry you. She leaned up and kissed him, barely a breath, but sure. When she pulled back, her eyes searched his. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He pulled her into his lap, wrapped his arms around her, and held her like she was the only thing that made sense in the world. Outside, the snow line crept lower on the ridge, but inside, the fire burned steady, and neither of them moved until it was down to embers. The first snow fell thin and early, dusting the ridge behind the cabin in a hush that made the world feel paused. Victor stood on the porch with a tin of nails, watching the sky harden to slate. Cassidy had gone quiet after breakfast, moving through the cabin with a kind of inwardness that made him leave her be. He hammered a loose board back into place and stepped inside, brushing cold from his sleeves. You ever see snow in Arizona? He asked, setting the tin on the table. Cassidy was kneeling near the hearth, stacking kindling with careful hands. Once. We'd gone farther north for trade. It melted by noon, but I remember it stung when it hit my skin. Victor nodded, then pulled off his coat. It'll stick here, might be a long winter. I'm not afraid of that. He looked at her, the way she sat still but alert, like a deer listening for something it couldn't name. Did something happen? She tied off the bundle of sticks and stood. I saw tracks near the stream. Deeper than yours. Victor's hand paused on the back of the chair. Boots, couldn't tell. They'd filled some with water, but wide set, like someone heavy or carrying weight. He considered that. We'll trap closer to the cabin until we know. Cassidy crossed to the table, picked up the ledger they'd been using to tally supplies. We've got enough flour and lard to get through the first freeze, but we'll need more salt. And cloth. I can mend what we have, but it won't last past January. Victor took the ledger from her, eyes scanning the page. There's a trader west of Elk Hollow. Quiet man, lives near the edge of the canyon. I can reach him and back in 4 days if the weather holds. Cassidy's brow tightened. You'd go alone, he met her gaze. I would. A long pause stretched between them. You don't think they'll come looking? She asked, voice lower now. I don't think they'll find us, and if they do, I'll be back before they can do anything about it. She turned toward the window, arms folded. If they do come, and I'm alone, Victor didn't let her finish. I'll teach you the signal. If you hear anything strange, take the rifle and go to the Pine Hollow. Stay there till I come. Cassidy nodded but didn't look convinced. That night, she lay beside him without speaking, her breathing shallow. He waited until he thought she'd drifted off, then reached for her hand. She laced her fingers through his without hesitation. The next morning, he saddled the mare and packed light. Cassidy handed him a strip of dried meat and a small pouch of cornmeal. There's a bend after the ridge, she said. If you ride past it, I won't be able to see you from the cabin. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder. I won't need to ride past it long. She stepped back, arms still crossed against the cold. Come back. I will. He rode out slow, the wind rising as he crested the ridge. When he looked back, she was standing at the edge of the clearing, no coat, no shawl, just watching. Victor reached the canyon by nightfall of the second day. The trader, a man called Merle, lived in a dugout framed with scrap tin and driftwood. He traded fairly, though his eyes lingered too long when Victor mentioned a woman waiting. "She your wife?" Merle asked, weighing the sack of salt. "Something like it," Victor said. He left before dawn, back heavy with supplies and thoughts heavier still. By the time he reached the high flats, the wind had shifted again. Snow was coming. He made it back just as the first flakes began to fall thick and wet. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sight of it settled something in his chest. Inside, the fire was going strong. Cassidy had stewed beans and wild onion, and the warmth of it wrapped around him as he stepped in. "You made good time," she said, taking his coat. "Didn't sleep much." "I wanted to get back before the weather turned." She poured him a bowl and handed him a tin cup of hot water steeped with pine needles. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting across from him. "About the land here. There's a spring farther up the hill. If we dig a channel, we could run water closer to the cabin." He nodded. "We'll do it before the ground freezes." She smiled, then looked down at her hands. "I told myself I wouldn't feel safe again. Not really. But when you came through those trees just now, I knew I wasn't waiting for nothing." Victor set the bowl down and leaned forward. "You weren't." Cassidy reached across the table and touched his face, fingers light. "This place, it doesn't feel like hiding anymore." He covered her hand with his. "That's 'cause it isn't." The wind pushed against the shutter, but the fire held, and the walls stayed warm. Cassidy stood and came to him, settling into his lap like it was the only place she belonged. Her lips found his with quiet certainty, and he kissed her back with the same. There were no more questions between them. Only the slow, steady rhythm of a life beginning, one breath at a time. By late December, the cabin sat half buried in snow, its low roof rimmed with icicles that caught the weak morning light. The wind had settled to a hush, the kind that pressed against the windows without sound, as if the world outside had gone still to listen. Victor laid the last of the firewood along the wall inside and wiped his hands on his trousers. Cassidy was bent over the corner table, sorting dried herbs into a tin box, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her fingers stained faintly green. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, nodding toward the bundles. "My mother's mother," she said, not looking up. "She used to say anything you need grows within a day's walk if you know how to see it." Victor watched her for a moment. "You believe that?" Cassidy tied off the last bundle, then turned. "I think people forget how to see, but I remember the smell of her hands." She used to rub sage between her fingers before she stirred the pot. Victor stepped closer. "You ever think of teaching that to someone else?" Cassidy shrugged. "Don't know who'd want to learn." He reached for her hand, rough against rough. "I would." Her eyes met his, steady. "You ever taught someone how to shoot straight?" Victor's mouth lifted slightly at one side. "Once or twice. Then I'd say we're even." They went out together that afternoon, the sun low but bright enough to make the snow glare. Victor showed her how to move quiet through drifted trails, how to watch the tree line without staring. Cassidy's hands were steady on the rifle, though her breath caught when the first shot cracked. The sound echoed off the ridges and came back hollow. "Not bad," Victor said, watching the branch she'd hit splinter and fall. She lowered the rifle. "I don't like the way it feels." "You don't have to like it," he said. "Just need to know how." They returned before dusk, boots soaked through. Cassidy knelt near the stove, untying the laces with numb fingers. Victor poured hot water into the basin and set it beside her without a word. She slipped her feet in and hissed softly, then leaned back against the wall, eyes closing. "I used to think winter was dead time," she said after a while. "But it's not. Things are just quiet, waiting." Victor sat across from her, folding his hands between his knees. "You always talk like you've lived twice as long as you have." Cassidy opened her eyes, looked at him. "Maybe I have." He didn't push further. The silence between them was full of things neither had said, but both understood. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters in short bursts. Victor rose once to check the latch, then returned to bed where Cassidy lay curled on her side. She shifted when he slid in beside her, her back pressing to his chest. He wrapped an arm around her waist, and she fit against him like a piece long missing. "I had a sister," she said into the dark. "Born before me, died before I could remember her. My mother used to say she was the quieter one." Victor's breath moved slow beside her ear. "You think about her often?" "Not until lately." She was quiet a moment. "I think I feel her more than I remember her." Victor pressed his lips to the back of her neck just once and said nothing. When morning came, the sky was a hard sheet of silver. Victor fetched more water while Cassidy boiled oats with a pinch of wild mint. They ate in comfortable quiet, the steam rising between them. Later, while she mended a tear in the curtain, Victor returned from the root cellar with a wooden box. "Found something," he said, setting it on the table. Cassidy came over, wiping her hands on her skirt. Inside the box lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, and beneath it, a pair of leather gloves sized for a woman's hands. She picked up the gloves, turning them over with care. "Belonged to the woman who lived here before," Victor said. "Might fit you." Cassidy slid them on. They were tight across her knuckles, but warm. "I wonder who she was." Victor unfolded the paper. "Her name was Judith. Says here she came from Missouri, lost a child, then came west. Her husband built this place for her." Cassidy touched the edge of the box. "Makes you wonder what kind of love builds something like this." Victor folded the letter again. "The kind that doesn't have to say much." Cassidy looked at him then, a long look, as if seeing something settle into place. That evening she brought out a bit of cloth she'd been working on, a square with careful stitches along the edge. She laid it in Victor's lap. "It's not much, but it's for you," she said. He ran a calloused finger along the seams. "What's it for?" "Whatever you need it to be." He folded it once, then tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Then I'll keep it close." Outside, night came slow and deep. Inside, the warmth held steady, and the quiet between them was no longer weighted. It was simply theirs. The snow had begun to ease by late January, and with it came the first stirrings of thaw. Not in the land that would take weeks yet, but in the sky's tone, and the way the wind no longer howled at night but breathed low along the eaves. Victor noticed it first as he stepped out early, the pale light catching the wet shine on the bark of the nearest spruce. Cassidy, still inside, was humming something she hadn't before, low and rhythmic, like it had come from her hands instead of her throat. He returned to find her seated at the table, a folded square of paper in front of her and a pencil balanced between her fingers. "You writing something?" he asked, brushing snow from his hat. Cassidy didn't look up. "I'm drawing, trying to remember the shape of a place." Victor hung his coat. "What place?" "The bluff behind our old house. Used to climb it before I was old enough to know better. There was a tree up there, bent sideways like it had been pulled by the wind for years." She turned the paper toward him. "I can't remember if it had leaves." Victor studied the sketch. "Maybe it didn't need them." She tilted her head, considering. "Maybe not." He made coffee, poured some into her tin without asking, and set it beside her. Cassidy reached for it absently, her gaze still on the paper. "I've been thinking about spring," she said. "What we could build. Not just the channel, a coop, maybe a smokehouse." Victor leaned against the counter. "You planning to take up butchering?" "I'd learn. You think I can't?" He gave a short laugh. "I think you'd be better at it than me." Cassidy traced a line on the paper with her nail. "What about a name?" "This place, should we name it?" Victor glanced toward the window. Beyond it, the trees stood close together, bark black with melt. "You got one in mind?" She hesitated. "I was thinking maybe Alder Hollow, for the trees. And because it sounds like somewhere people could begin again." Victor nodded slowly. "Alder Hollow, then." The next day, they hiked out past the ridge together, not for game but to mark the boundaries of what they might call their land. Victor carried a hatchet and notched the trees where they turned. Cassidy walked ahead sometimes, pausing to feel the slope of the ground or press her hand to a stone that jutted from the earth like a spine. At the far edge of their walk, they found a glade where the snow had thinned, and a trickle of water ran beneath the roots of a beech. Cassidy crouched beside it, dipping her fingers in the icy flow. "You think we could run water from here down to the cabin?" she asked. Victor knelt beside her. "Could be done, would take some digging." "I don't mind hard work," she said, "not when it's for something that's mine." He looked at her, not speaking. She turned to meet his gaze. "I mean ours," she said. They walked back in silence, but it wasn't the kind that held distance. It was the kind that filled the space between two people with something understood. By mid-February, the first green tips of spruce buds began to show near the creek bed. Victor returned from checking the trap line with a brace of rabbits and a branch of early willow. He set the branch on the table like an offering. "Figured it might be time," he said. Cassidy picked it up gently, turned it in her hands. "Feels like a promise." That evening, she brought out the old ledger they'd used for supplies and turned to a blank page. She wrote the date at the top, then looked at Victor. "We should start keeping better records. For the land, what we plant, what we build," he nodded. "We'll need a new book soon." Cassidy smiled. "I'll sew one." In March, they dug the first furrow for the garden with a spade Victor had bartered for from the canyon trader. The ground was slow to give, but when it did, the soil was dark and rich with old leaf. Cassidy pressed her fingers into it like she was greeting something returned. They planted beans, squash, and a patch of corn against the southern edge. Victor built a small fence from cedar saplings, and Cassidy tied strips of cloth to keep the deer out. One clear morning, as they sat on the stoop with coffee cooling beside them, Cassidy spoke without preamble. "I want to marry you." Victor turned toward her, caught off guard only for a breath. "You sure?" She nodded. "I don't need a preacher or a paper. I just want to stand beside you and call this life ours." Victor reached for her hand, rough against his. "Then we're married now. Here." "Like this?" Cassidy blinked once, then smiled something deep and unguarded and leaned forward to kiss him. It was not rushed or uncertain. It was a binding. They spent the day gathering wildflowers and ferns, and that evening, as the sun dropped gold across the hollow, they stood beneath the bent limb of an older tree and spoke the only words they needed. "I choose you," Cassidy said. "I choose you," Victor returned. When the wind stirred the leaves above them, it felt like something bearing witness. Years passed, and Alder Hollow grew with them. They built the smokehouse and the coop, and later, a small lean-to for tools. They harvested their first full garden by the end of that summer, and Cassidy lined the shelves with jars of beans and corn cut from the cob. Victor carved a new table from pine and etched their initials beneath it, where only she would know to look. They never had children, though not for lack of trying, but it didn't settle heavy between them. Their home was full with quiet, with work, with love measured in long glances and calloused hands reaching for one another at the end of each day. Cassidy kept drawing, pages filled with the shape of the land and the bend of trees. Victor kept the rifle cleaned and the mare shoed. They grew older, their hair silvering, but their steps remained sure. On the first day of their 10th spring together, Cassidy placed a new sign at the edge of the path. Alder Hollow established by love. Victor stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and they looked out over the land they'd shaped together. Neither spoke. They didn't need to.